Well, let's discuss these reports now with founder of Syriana Analysis outlet, Kevork Almassian. Many thanks for joining us on the programme. It's very good to see you today. So first of all, I'd like to ask for your reaction to these reports that Ukraine's planning to accuse Russia of using chemical weapons at the OPCW tomorrow.
This is not a defense of Russia, but isn't it ironic that every time a winning side against a proxy of the United States and the UK, the winning side allegedly uses chemical weapons against the losing side? This is completely, in my opinion, ridiculous to see in the context of the military operations in Ukraine itself. However, we have to address the big elephant in the room here. The last time the OPCW tried to do a good job was in Iraq in 2002 when the Secretary General was Jose Bustani. And back then, John Bolton, he went to the office of Jose Bustani and threatened him with his sons and told him that he knows the place of his sons. And since then, he resigned and the OPCW unfortunately has been hijacked. And the proof of that was after the war in Syria. Now, in 2018, this was a big scandal in Syria that the OPCW inspectors came and they concluded that the chlorine gas has not been used in the Duma incident. However, a tripartite aggression has happened against Syria back then by the UK, the United States, and France. However, the administration of the OPCW, they have doctored and changed the conclusions of the inspectors themselves and the researchers who were on the ground in Syria. Therefore, when we speak of the OPCW, we are speaking of a compromised organization nowadays that can falsify a report against a sovereign country and justify a foreign aggression. Therefore, if we want to put it in a greater context, now in the war in Ukraine, the allies of Ukraine, they need further justifications in front of their people to further send funds to Ukraine. Because remember, those who are living in Europe nowadays, we are carrying a heavy burden on our shoulders from our taxpayer money. Nobody asks us if we want to send our taxpayer money to Ukraine. However, we are sending billions of dollars per year to Ukraine nowadays, and this is leading to inflation and also the increase of the groceries and the basic necessities such as gas and fuel and heating. So I think that in this context, the Americans need this provocation in Ukraine, and especially through their proxy Ukraine nowadays there, in order to further agree to send more foreign aid and more security or military packages to Ukraine. And we have to remember that Ukraine, under the current regime, has a track record of committing terrorist attacks, for example, in Russia, assassinations, and also the alleged involvement in the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipelines. Therefore, the losing side in such a scenario has the interest in such a provocation in order to invite the allies to send more weapons and more ammunition into the country. But the only loser in this situation and in this equation are going to be the Ukrainian people. Please remember that the use of such chemical substances in Ukraine is going to harm not only the ordinary people, the non-combatants and the combatants, but also the environment, the soil. And we were speaking of a very rich soil where the farms of the wheat, for example, are enormous in Ukraine. So this is going to also harm the food basket of the world, not only the food basket of the Ukrainians, but the entire world. So this is a very dystopian scenario if it comes true, in my opinion.
Yeah. I mean, Russia did previously report on Ukrainian forces using prohibited substances in battle, but there was no international investigation. There's yet to be any investigation. Why the lapse of OPCW oversight there?
This is a very good question. Actually, in April 2013, the Syrian army came under a chlorine gas attack, and the Syrian side called for the OPCW to send inspectors to decide if a chemical weapon attack happened and who did it. However, the Americans and the Brits, they vetoed this, and they said after 6 months of a delay that they will send UN inspectors to check if a chemical attack happened, but not who did the chemical attack. And ironically, on the night of the arrival of the inspectors to Syria, on the same night, we are speaking of the 28th of August, another chemical attack happened in Ghouta in 2013, which there was a use of a sarin gas and led to the killing of 1,200 people. So who benefited from these attacks and who is benefiting from the weaponization of the OPCW? I think the answers are quite clear nowadays. We have to be in support of international law. We have to be in support of the Geneva Protocol of the 1925 and the Chemical Weapons Convention in 1997, because we don't want for such weapons to be used in Ukraine or in Syria or anywhere else. So the countries who were committed and signed these conventions, for example, Russia destroyed its chemical stockpile, Syria did the same. And despite the direct observation and the participation of the OPCW in the destruction of these prohibited weapons, after the destruction of these weapons, still there is such attacks are carried out, and the parties who destroyed the chemical weapons are the ones who are accused of using these chemical weapons.
In 2018, I mean, this was such a huge story. The world was really shaken by these reports of chemical weapons being used by the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, which turned out to be false. What parallels can you draw between 2018 and the current situation?
Actually, there are big parallels then and now. However, in the current situation, the Americans and the other NATO allies cannot really come directly and attack Russia. Therefore, in this context, they will only use such provocations and such incidences in order to increase the weapon supplies to Ukraine. However, in the Syrian case, it's because Syria was a weaker side in this case and a smaller country, they have conducted illegal airstrikes against Syria, and on false allegations, because later this has been proven to be completely false. So the question here bears, how did the 50 or 60 or 70 civilians got killed in 2018 when allegedly a chemical attack happened? And why the white helmets, which is an MI6 product in Syria, why did they fake the first images of the alleged attack? Because the cylinder, the picture that they posted online, the first image, they had made a mistake and the cylinder was upside down. So they deleted the photo and posted another photo after changing the cylinder. And also, how can it be possible that the cylinder falls from the sky on the 4th floor, for example, and breaks through the ceiling and then sits peacefully on a bed? There were so many questions on these attacks. However, we are not living in normal times. The facts do not really matter. What the Americans say and the Brits say and their intelligence apparatuses and their mouthpieces in the press say, those are the ones that are considered facts, because facts need evidence and proof. And we not only have an evidence for the falsification of this alleged chemical attack in Duma, we have almost the proof that this didn't happen, and the white helmets were involved in this attack, in the theater of this attack. So in my opinion, I don't think that the Americans need an evidence now in Ukraine. They can just get along with the allegations, and they have the support of the OPCW administration in this case, who have kicked out the researchers and the scientists who were dissenting after the 2018 alleged chemical attack in Syria, who said that their findings were distorted. And they protested against the administration, but the administration has not met with them, not even once after this incident. So I leave the conclusion for you.
And yet, 5 years after the alleged gas attack on the Syrian city of Douma, the OPCW Director General reported there are reasonable grounds to believe the attack did take place. That's despite all the mountain evidence that you just spoke about and the video being circulated, filming people insisting no chemical attack ever happened. Why, in your view, did the OPCW support that gas attack narrative? And what do the wider public believe about what happened in Syria? Do they understand that it was a falsified attack with all the evidence, or do they just remember all the sensationalized headlines and believe that that did actually happen?
John Bolton threatened the former head of the OPCW, and he told him that he knows where is the place of his sons. He threatened the life of his sons. So of course there is an enormous pressure on the leadership and the administration of the OPCW from the US and from the UK. And recently there was an enormous pressure against the ICC's the leadership of the ICC to not issue an arrest warrant against Netanyahu. So the international law and the so-called rules-based order that we are living under nowadays is nothing but a joke, excuse me, but we are no longer living in an international system or international law. It's a big chaos and it's a jungle. And what's happening in the Gaza Strip nowadays and in Lebanon and in Syria, in the region overall, with all the acts of ethnic cleansing and genocide and the complete inaction of the same players in the region is another proof that they don't care about international law, but they will weaponize these international organizations against their enemies. Therefore, I think we are headed to a complete annihilation of what is called the international system, and we're living in a situation that even the United Nations could be crumbled in the near future in order for a new organization to be formed under a multipolar world, because we are living in a transitional period, and the Americans are trying to keep their hegemonic status, and therefore they're trying to exert maximum pressure on these organizations to protect their assets on the international scene. Now, in Syria, the vast majority of the Syrian people, they know that this was orchestrated and it was a theater in Duma, and they are asking a legitimate question. Who killed the civilians in Duma in 2018 under this alleged chemical attack, and how they were killed? If it's not by a chlorine gas, all these women and children who were killed on that day, who killed them and how did they get killed? So we deserve answers for this. However, the OPCW administration refuses up until this moment to give us the real answers on this, and they insisted until this moment to continue in this falsification and also the suppression of their own scientists. We're speaking of people who work for the OPCW, and they were the investigators on the ground in Syria. And until this moment, these investigators are sidelined and their voices are not heard by the OPCW.
Thank you so much for speaking to us today. It's really good to get your thoughts on the situation. We've been talking to the founder of Syriana Analysis, Kevork Almassian. Thank you.
Mi nem engedjük be az illegális migránsokat. Mi megvédjük a határokat. A határ engedély nélküli átlépése bűncselekmény. Csak az jöhet be, akinek engedélyt adunk. És az engedélyt a határokon kívül kell megvárni. Magyarországon a migránsok száma 0. Mi nem adjuk át az országunkat, nem engedjük, hogy megváltoztassák a kultúránkat. Magyarország a mi otthonunk, és otthon akarjuk benne érezni magunkat. De az európai baloldal és a brüsszeli bürokraták ma együtt büntetik Magyarországot. 200 millió eurót kellett eddig fizetnünk, minden nap 1 millió eurót fizetünk, mert nem engedjük be a migránsokat. Azért büntetnek a brüsszeliek, mert nem engedjük be a migránsokat, mert védjük Európát. Ez szégyen, ez Brüsszel szégyene. De tudjátok mit? Ha tovább büntetnek bennünket, akkor a migránsokat Budapestről Brüsszelbe fogjuk szállítani, és letesszük őket a brüsszeli hivatalok elé. A migránsokat akarnak, meg fogják kapni.
Today I was reading a statement by a European politician, and he says that we will not surrender our country, we will not allow the migrants, the illegal immigrants, to change our culture. This is our home, and we want to feel at home in it. Look, if I was a European, probably I'm saying that I would have a similar sentiments, and I would say, Germany, I would like to keep it German, or Hungary, I would like to keep it Hungarian. However, we have to really address the root cause of this crisis, why we have big refugee crisis and migration crisis in Europe itself. And the root cause goes to few factors. The first factor is the wars. From where these refugees and migrants are coming to Europe: Afghanistan, Syria, Iraq, and the African continent. So why, you may ask, all these migrants are coming here? Because there is insecurity in their own countries, and there is war and devastation. Who created these wars to begin with? Afghanistan, it was the invasion of the United States. Iraq, it was the invasion of the United States and the UK with full support and provocation from Israel. The Palestinian refugees after the Nakba, those who they call them stateless people in Europe, why they came to Europe? Because they were kicked out of their homes and they arrived to Europe. And nowadays they are still stateless. Why there are so many Africans coming to Europe, especially after 2011? Because the United States and NATO countries have bombed Libya, and they allowed all these refugees and migrants to come to Europe. So they created the conditions for these migrants and refugees to arrive to Europe. Secondly, the second factor is the monopoly over the financial systems and the banking system around the world and the weaponization of the dollar. So the US weaponized the dollar and started sanctioning the central banks of foreign countries because they don't like the foreign policy of this country. And this led into economic crisis and hyperinflations and joblessness in these countries. And the people find themselves in a very desperate situation that the only solution is to leave and go to Europe. So who's paying the biggest price for this migration crisis? Are the Europeans. But who are the powers creating these wars in the region? This is the major question. Now, Israel is carpet bombing both Gaza and Lebanon. And if refugees arrive now from Palestine and from Lebanon to Europe, whose fault is this? Whose weapons and whose bombs are falling over the heads of the civilians in Lebanon and in Palestine?